There's a moment most people have had at least once. You're sitting somewhere, maybe at your kitchen table, maybe in your car after a long shift, and you're doing the math in your head. You're adding up what you made this month, subtracting what you owe, and somewhere in the middle of that calculation, something quiet and heavy settles into your chest. Not panic, not anger, just this slow, familiar realization that you are working very hard and somehow still ending up in the same place. And the frustrating part isn't the number itself, it's that you don't know why. You're not lazy, you're not reckless, you show up, you do the work, but the gap between where you are and where you thought you'd be by now feels wider every year, not narrower. So you do what most people do. You look for the obvious explanations: the economy, the job market, the fact that you didn't have the right connections or the right background or the right degree. And those things are real. I'm not going to pretend they aren't. But here's what I've come to believe. And this is the thing that took me a long time to sit with, honestly. The bigger problem usually isn't on the outside. It's in the way we've been trained to think about money, effort, and what's actually possible for us. Not what we say we believe, not what we tell people at dinner, what we actually quietly believe when we're alone with our thoughts. That's where this conversation begins. Think about the way most of us grew up learning about money and success. If we were lucky, someone told us to work hard, save a little, don't take risks, be grateful for what you have. And that advice came from people who loved us, people who were trying to protect us, people who had been burned by uncertainty and didn't want to see us burned too. So we absorbed it. We went to school, did what we were supposed to do, took the jobs that felt safe, and told ourselves that consistency would eventually add up to something meaningful. And for a long time, that felt true, or at least it felt responsible. But somewhere along the way, something shifts. You look up from the routine and realize that the consistency you've been building is consistency in staying the same. The job is stable, but it's not growing. The savings exist, but they're not compounding into anything that changes your life. The years are moving fast, and the big thing you always thought would happen, the business, the investment, the breakthrough, it keeps getting pushed to some version of later that never quite arrives. And what makes it worse is that you probably know someone who doesn't seem that different from you. Similar background, similar starting point, maybe even fewer advantages. But something changed for them. Something clicked. And now the gap between your lives feels impossible to explain through luck or timing alone. I've seen this play out so many times. Smart, hardworking people who spent decades grinding toward a goal that never materialized, not because they lacked talent, but because the way they thought about what they were doing was fundamentally misaligned with what actually creates results. The difference between those two groups of people isn't intelligence, it isn't even effort most of the time. It's something quieter than that. Something that happens at the level of belief and decision-making before any action is ever taken. And that is exactly what this book, written almost 100 years ago, figured out. Not through theory, through studying real people over real decades who built real wealth from very little. The patterns he found were not what anyone expected, and they're still not what most people talk about today. Let me tell you about a man named Edwin Barnes. He was nobody. He had no money, no connections, no credentials, and no reason for anyone to take him seriously. But he had one thing, a specific, burning desire to go into business with Thomas Edison, who was at that time the most famous inventor in the world. Not to work for Edison, not to be near Edison, to be his business partner. When people heard this, they laughed, and honestly, who could blame them? Barnes arrived at Edison's laboratory looking like a drifter. He had borrowed his way there. He had nothing to offer on paper. But he got the meeting, and something in the way Barnes spoke, the specificity of what he wanted, the certainty behind it, made Edison give him a chance. Not as a partner, not yet, but as a floor worker. Barnes took it. He showed up every day with the same intention he walked in with. Years later, when Edison developed a new machine called the Ediphone, everyone in his organization dismissed it. They didn't think it would sell.
Barnes, who had been watching and waiting, recognized the opportunity immediately. He approached Edison and asked to be the one to sell it. Edison agreed. Barnes went on to make a fortune selling that machine. He became exactly what he said he would become, a business partner of Thomas Edison. Now here's the thing I want you to sit with. What Barnes had wasn't confidence in the traditional sense. He wasn't cocky. He wasn't performing certainty. He had a specific desire and an absolute commitment to that specific outcome. Not to doing well or making money or finding success in business. He wanted one specific thing, and that specificity changed how he saw every situation. Most people are walking around with vague wishes. They want more money or a better life, or they want to not stress as much. And those aren't goals, they're moods. They shift depending on the day, the comparison, the conversation you just had. What Napoleon Hill found across hundreds of interviews with people who built lasting wealth was that it always started with a desire so specific it was almost uncomfortable. Not a preference, not a direction, a specific destination. The discomfort in that is real, because the moment you get specific about what you want, you have to give up the excuse of vagueness. You can no longer say, "I'm working towards something big," without being able to describe exactly what big means. And that vulnerability, the act of saying, "This is exactly what I want," is something most people quietly avoid their entire lives. The question isn't whether you want more. Almost everyone wants more. The question is whether you want something specific enough to organize your decisions around it, even when the path isn't clear.
There's a difference between wanting something and deciding on something. Most of us have spent years in the wanting stage, and we've mistaken that feeling for commitment. Think about the last time you said you wanted to start a business, or lose weight, or finally get your finances in order. You meant it when you said it. The desire was real. But somewhere between the intention and the follow-through, something faded. Life got in the way. The initial energy dissolved into the ordinary friction of daily responsibilities. That happens to almost everyone. And for a long time, people interpreted that pattern as a character flaw. They told themselves they lacked discipline or willpower or something fundamental that other people had and they didn't. But Hill's research pointed somewhere else. He noticed that the people who actually followed through on things, especially difficult, long-term things, weren't relying on willpower at all. Willpower is a limited resource. It depletes. It's inconsistent. It's dependent on how much sleep you got and how your morning went. What those people had was something different. He called it a burning desire. And what made it burning wasn't the intensity of the feeling. It was the clarity of the commitment behind it. He described it this way. A burning desire means you've made a decision that is no longer negotiable. You're not considering alternatives. You're not leaving the door open to, maybe I'll try something else if this doesn't work. You've chosen a direction, and the only question in your mind is how you'll get there, not whether you will. That sounds extreme, maybe even rigid, but think about what happens to a person's decision-making when they operate from that position. Every choice filters through a different question. Instead of, should I do this, it becomes, does this move me toward what I've committed to? That's a completely different cognitive framework. A man named Henley wrote a poem that Hill quoted often. The line was, "I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul." And Hill's interpretation of that wasn't motivational, it was practical. The master of your fate isn't the person with the most talent or the best circumstances. It's the person who has decided on something and organized their thinking around it so completely that the outcome almost becomes inevitable. That organization of thinking, that decision-making filter, is built by one thing: the specificity and firmness of what you've committed to. The shift isn't dramatic. It doesn't happen in a single moment of inspiration. It happens when you stop treating your goals as things you'd like to achieve and start treating them as things you've already decided will happen. The planning follows, the action follows, but first, the decision has to be real. Here's something Hill wrote that still surprises people when they hear it for the first time. He believed that whatever the mind can conceive and believe, it can achieve. And I know how that sounds. It sounds like a poster in a high school gym. It sounds like something people say at seminars before they ask you to buy a course. But strip away the slogan quality of it for a moment and look at what he was actually describing. He wasn't saying that positive thinking summons results from thin air. He was describing a mechanism, a process, and the process works like this. Your mind, at any given moment, is building something, a picture of what is realistic, what is possible, what you are capable of, and what you deserve. That picture was built over years through your experiences, your failures, the reactions of people around you, and the quiet conclusions you drew from all of it. Most of it was built without your conscious participation. And that picture, that internal model of reality, determines what you notice, what you pursue, what you attempt, and what you walk past without even seeing. There's a concept in psychology sometimes called selective attention. The idea is simple. Your brain cannot process everything in your environment simultaneously, so it filters. It highlights what it thinks is relevant and ignores the rest. And what determines relevance? Your existing beliefs about what matters, what's possible, and what applies to you. This is why two people can sit in the same meeting, hear the same opportunity described, and have completely different reactions. One person sees a door. The other person sees a wall. Not because one of them is smarter, but because their internal model of what's possible for them is different. Hill called this the subconscious mind, and he spent a lot of time on it. His argument was that if you want to change your outcomes, you have to change the picture. And the way you change the picture is through what he called auto-suggestion, the deliberate, repetitive feeding of your mind with the specific idea you've committed to. This is where some readers check out because it starts to sound mystical, but I'd encourage you to think about it mechanically instead. If you spend years telling yourself that money is hard to come by, that people like you don't get breaks like that success is for people with advantages you don't have, you are running an auto-suggestion program. It's just a negative one. It runs automatically because you've run it so long. Hill's point was that you can run a different program, not through affirmations as a ritual, but through the genuine, repeated, focused contemplation of what you're working toward and who you intend to become. Done consistently, that changes what your brain filters for. It changes what you notice. It changes the questions you ask in a given situation, and that changes the decisions you make day after day in ways that eventually compound into different outcomes. The mind builds something constantly. The only question is whether you're directing the construction. I want to talk about something Hill said that most people get wrong. He made a distinction between two kinds of knowledge: general knowledge, the kind you get in school, the kind that makes you good at trivia, and specialized knowledge, meaning deep expertise in the specific area where you're trying to create value or wealth. And his observation was that the most educated people in a room were not always the wealthiest. Often they weren't even close. The people building substantial wealth were frequently people with very specific knowledge in very specific areas, combined with the ability to think clearly and make decisions quickly. He told a story about a powerful industrialist who was once challenged in court. The opposing attorney tried to embarrass him by asking him questions from various academic fields: history, science, literature. The man couldn't answer most of them. The attorney used this to suggest he was ignorant and unfit to hold the authority he held. The man responded, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he had surrounded himself with people who could answer any of those questions within minutes, and that knowing who to ask and being able to act on the answers was far more valuable than carrying that information in his own head. This points to what Hill called the mastermind, not a metaphysical concept, a practical one. He noticed that people who built real, lasting wealth almost never did it alone. They built a group of people around them, people with specific knowledge and skills they didn't have themselves, people who shared their purpose or at least aligned with it closely enough to function as a coherent unit.
The combined thinking, knowledge, and energy of that group created something that none of them could have created individually. He compared it to electricity. Certain currents cannot be produced by a single source, but can be produced by the combination of multiple sources working in harmony. Most people try to succeed in isolation. They protect their ideas, they avoid asking for help because it feels like weakness, they try to figure everything out themselves before they take any steps, and that approach limits them profoundly. The people who move fastest, who build the most, who sustain momentum over long periods, almost without exception, they figured out how to surround themselves with the right people early. Not users, not people who drain energy and offer nothing. People who are genuinely excellent at what they do and who are aligned, at least in direction, with what you're building. This also applies to the plan itself. Hill was clear that the first plan is almost never the right plan. The people who succeed aren't the ones who had the perfect strategy from the beginning. They're the ones who made a decision, started moving, got information from the movement, adjusted, and kept going. They treated the plan as a living document, not a contract with their original idea. The combination of those two things, the right people and the willingness to adapt, is one of the clearest patterns in every story of meaningful success Hill documented.
Here's a pattern I've noticed, and it shows up again and again in the research Hill did and in the stories he gathered. Most people don't fail because they try the wrong thing. They fail because they never fully commit to trying anything. They exist in a permanent state of consideration, planning without acting, researching without deciding, preparing for a moment they keep pushing forward. Hill had a name for this. He called it the habit of procrastination, but he meant something deeper than just putting things off. He meant the tendency to wait for perfect conditions, for more money, more knowledge, more confidence, more time before taking a step. And that wait compounds quietly into years, then decades, without the person ever quite realizing what they've traded. He talked about a concept called decision, and he was very specific about it. He found that people who built wealth made decisions quickly and changed them slowly. People who didn't build wealth made decisions slowly and changed them quickly. Read that again because it's worth sitting with. When you make decisions slowly, you're usually waiting for more certainty. But certainty doesn't come before the decision. It comes from the action that follows the decision. You learn by moving. You get clarity by doing. The information that would make you confident is locked inside the experience you're avoiding because you're not yet confident enough to begin. That loop is one of the most common traps in adult life. And the reason people change decisions quickly after finally making them is usually because of outside pressure. Someone expresses doubt. Circumstances shift slightly. A competing option presents itself. And because the original decision wasn't firm, because it was made tentatively, it dissolves under the first real test. Hill described a man who had almost reached a significant breakthrough in business 3 times, and 3 times turned back just before it materialized, because the resistance before a breakthrough always looks identical to evidence that you're failing. He couldn't tell the difference, so he stopped. There's a quiet tragedy in that, and I think most people, if they're being honest, can find a version of that story somewhere in their own history. The thing they almost did, the decision they didn't make in time, the moment that passed because they were still waiting to feel ready. The habit of decision doesn't mean being reckless. It means building a practice of trusting your judgment enough to move, accepting that adjustments will be necessary, and staying in motion long enough for real information to come back to you. There's a story Hill told that I think about more than almost anything else in this book. A man named Darby had an uncle who caught the gold fever in the time of the great gold rushes. He staked his claim, started digging, and found gold ore. He covered up the mine, went back east, borrowed money from family, bought equipment, and came back to work the claim properly. For a while, the gold came. Then it stopped. The vein went cold. They drilled, shifted, searched, and found nothing.
Eventually, they gave up, sold the equipment to a junk dealer for almost nothing, and went home, defeated. The junk dealer, being curious, consulted a mining engineer before he did anything with the equipment. The engineer took one look at the situation, studied the ground, and told him the vein hadn't disappeared, it had simply shifted. If Darby's uncle had drilled 3 more feet in a different direction, he would have found one of the richest gold deposits in that area. The junk dealer went on to make a fortune from that mine. Darby went on to make a fortune too, eventually, in life insurance, because he never forgot the lesson. Every time a prospect said no, he thought about those 3 feet. He pushed a little further, held on a little longer, refused to quit at the point where most people fold, and he became one of the most successful salesmen of his era. Hill's point wasn't that you should never stop anything. Sometimes quitting is absolutely the right call. His point was about where most people quit, which is almost always just before the breakthrough. Not because the thing isn't working, but because they can't see what's coming, and the discomfort of uncertainty becomes more powerful than the commitment to the goal. Persistence, in the way Hill defined it, isn't stubbornness. It's the discipline to stay in motion when momentum has slowed, when feedback is unclear, when enthusiasm has faded, and all that's left is the original decision you made. He found that people who built real wealth had almost universally experienced significant failure somewhere in their story. Not minor setbacks, real losses, real humiliation, real moments where quitting would have been completely reasonable and no one would have blamed them. The wealth came after they stayed. That's not inspirational as much as it's structural. Persistence in the face of failure is what generates the data and the experience that leads to the eventual breakthrough. You can't skip that phase. You can only decide whether you're going to be in it or not.
The last major idea I want to spend time on is one that Hill was almost hesitant to write about because he knew it would sound strange to practical-minded readers. He believed that emotion was the fuel behind any sustained effort, not logic, not reason, not analysis. And he was right, though not in the way self-help culture typically interprets it. When he talked about emotion, he wasn't talking about enthusiasm or excitement or passion in the Instagram sense. He was talking about the feeling that connects you to what you want, the reason behind the goal, the why that exists underneath the what. He listed specific emotions that he believed had the power to drive sustained action: faith, love, desire, and a few others. And he listed emotions that would undermine it, fear being the primary one. He identified what he called the 6 ghosts of fear: fear of poverty, fear of criticism, fear of ill health, fear of loss of love, fear of old age, fear of death. And he argued that one or more of these fears was operating, largely unconsciously, in the mind of almost every person who was not achieving what they were capable of. The fear of poverty is worth pausing on because it's the most directly relevant. He observed something counterintuitive, that people who feared poverty intensely often organized their entire lives around avoiding the feeling of scarcity rather than building actual abundance. And those 2 orientations lead to completely different behaviors. When you're avoiding poverty, you take safe options. You don't risk what you have. You optimize for security over growth. You say no to opportunities that could fail because the downside feels more real and more immediate than the upside, which feels distant and uncertain. When you're building abundance, you're operating from a different frame. The question isn't, what could I lose, but what is this worth building toward? And that framing, applied consistently, changes the choices you make. Hill believed that the antidote to fear was faith. Not religious faith necessarily, though he didn't exclude it, but faith as a mental state, the practiced, deliberate belief in a specific outcome, the willingness to act as if the thing you're working toward will happen before you have any evidence that it will. And this is where the practical and the philosophical converge in this book, because faith, in Hill's framework, isn't passive. It's not sitting and believing and waiting. It's the state of mind that drives the specific plan, the persistent action, the decision-making, the surrounding yourself with the right people. Faith is the emotional engine behind all the practical machinery. Without it, the practical tools become hollow.
You can have a plan, a goal, a mastermind group, and still self-sabotage at every critical moment because deep down, some quiet part of you doesn't believe you're the kind of person who ends up on the winning side. That belief, quiet, old, rarely spoken out loud, is the thing that needs to be examined. It's the real work, and it's work that doesn't have a weekend timeline.
Here's what most people don't realize until it's been going on for too long. The way you think about money and possibility isn't a personality trait, it's a habit. It was formed through repetition, reinforced by experience, and now it runs automatically, the way any habit does, below the level of conscious decision-making. And habits, by definition, reproduce themselves. That's what they're built to do. So if you carry a belief that money is fundamentally difficult, that your circumstances are largely determined by forces outside your control, that the kind of wealth or freedom you admire in others is simply not in the cards for you, you will make 10,000 small decisions a day that confirm and reinforce that belief. Not on purpose, not consciously, just because that's what the programming tells you to do. The problem isn't any single decision, it's the compound effect of 100 small decisions, each one nudged slightly by an underlying belief you've never directly challenged. That's the invisible mechanism, the thing that operates underneath every plan you make and every goal you set. And until you look at it directly, until you're willing to ask, what do I actually believe? Not what do I say I believe, but what does my behavior suggest I believe? The surface level changes won't hold. Most people don't realize that they've been carrying someone else's definition of what's realistic for them. Parents, teachers, peers, early failures, they all contribute to a picture that gets installed before you have the capacity to question it. And then you spend your adult life making choices that are perfectly logical given that picture, without ever questioning whether the picture is accurate. The gap between where you are and where you could be is almost never a gap in ability. It's a gap in the story you've accepted about what's possible. So let's talk about what actually changes things. Not in a sweeping, dramatic way, just in the practical daily sense. The first thing is to get specific, genuinely specific. Not, I want to make more money, but I want to build a business that earns a specific amount by a specific date through a specific means. Write that down. Sit with how uncomfortable it feels to be that specific. That discomfort is useful. It means you've moved from wishing to declaring, and declaring is the beginning of accountability. The second thing is to look honestly at your relationship with decisions. If you notice that you tend to make decisions slowly, wait for more information, change course when things get hard, or seek validation before committing, that's the pattern to work on, not the plan itself, the pattern underneath the plan. The practice here is to start making small decisions faster and holding them longer. Build the muscle. Train yourself to trust your own judgment at a smaller scale so that when larger decisions arrive, you have a track record with yourself that makes commitment easier. The third thing is to examine your environment. Not just who you spend time with, but what ideas you're regularly exposed to, what you read, what you watch, what conversations you have. Because the mind builds its picture from whatever raw material is consistently available. If you're saturated in news that confirms scarcity and fear, that becomes the default setting. If you deliberately, consistently expose your mind to models of what's possible, of how people navigate difficult circumstances and build something meaningful, that gradually becomes the default instead. This isn't about optimism, it's about input. You don't need to be positive, you need to be deliberate about what goes in. The fourth thing is to start where you are. This sounds obvious, but it's genuinely one of the things people fail to do. They wait for the conditions to improve before they begin. But the conditions respond to movement, not the other way around. The plan gets clearer once you're inside it. The people appear once you've taken enough steps to be visible. The opportunities surface once you're positioned to see them. You don't need more preparation. You probably need less. You need one committed step taken today that is aligned with the specific thing you've decided on. And finally, and I mean this as gently as I can, the work on the belief level is real work.
It doesn't happen from reading one book or having one insight. It happens from the slow, deliberate practice of examining what you actually believe, questioning the conclusions you drew from early experiences, and choosing to install different premises about what is possible for you. That's not an overnight project, but every day you don't start it is a day the old programming runs unchallenged.
I want to end this quietly, because I think this is a subject that deserves quiet. What this book figured out almost 100 years ago is that the gap between where most people are and where they want to be is not primarily a resource gap, it's a thinking gap. And a thinking gap is, by definition, something that can be closed. Not easily, not quickly, not without discomfort and failure, and long stretches where the progress isn't visible to anyone, including yourself, but it can be closed. Because the way you think is not fixed, it was learned, and what was learned can be unlearned, examined, and replaced with something more useful. You don't need to be extraordinary. You don't need advantages you don't have. You need a specific decision held firmly, a plan held loosely, people around you who elevate the level of what you think is possible, and the willingness to stay in motion when everything in you is suggesting it might be time to stop. That's not a formula for guaranteed wealth. Nothing is. But it's a significantly different way of operating than most people ever try. And different ways of operating, sustained over time, produce different outcomes. That's really all this is about.